Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I've been wondering if the musical Camelot might also have been named A Little Night Music, featuring such songs as The Guinevere Takes It All and Manhattan Transfer's enormous hit Chanson d'Armes. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Musical Talk, and today we're going to continue our coverage of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2024. It is, of course, the world's largest arts festival, and it incorporates all sides of the creative world of the arts, including, fortunately for us, musical theatre. And we're going to be talking about 3 shows in particular in this episode. And they are Fringe! Of the musical, Reject Me Already, and a musical called A Show About Tomorrow. All 3 of which were really enjoyable shows, which had something of interest to offer us here at Musical Talk, and I hope that you'll enjoy hearing all about them, because today I'm going to be talking about those 3 shows with Colm Malloy, regular presenter here on Musical Talk, and a composer in his own right. Now, the shows Reject Me Already and A Show About Tomorrow are really quite interesting, and they are, if you like, of a piece, because they have what might be called a gimmick, and that is in the formatting of those shows, because both shows gave you, the audience, an opportunity to pick, in one case, the combinations of actors to play the characters, and in another, to pick an outcome of 4 possible conclusions to the show. So there was a real opportunity for audience involvement in the outcome of those shows, in how you picked from the options available to you. Fringe the musical, however, which is the first we'll be talking about today, wasn't a gimmicky show in that sense, but of course it was quite self-aware, because it was a show about the very arts festival at which it was performing. Now, I should say there were 2 shows called Fringe the musical at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year. One was, in fact, about a barber shop. So the Fringe in question was in fact hair-based, tonsorial, if you like. Now, I'm afraid I didn't get to see that show because it was on at a later stage in the Fringe, by which time I had left Scotland. But I did get to see Fringe! The musical, and that's how I'm going to differentiate them. Fringe, the musical, which was about the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, was actually called Fringe! The musical. Whereas Fringe, the tonsorial musical, did not have the exclamation mark. So if you're looking them up online, that is the differential you'll need to go for. Now, Fringe the musical was a great comic show, and I knew it would be, because it was the show that was written by the people behind Potty the Plant. But it did do something slightly different to Potty. It had a greater subplot of sincerity. And it's interesting to see that production team pushing at the envelope of what they can do, I think very successfully. So it had all the flavours of the comedy of Potty the Plant, but also just a touch more heart. Reject Me Already was much more of a musical about a boy meets girl situation. In some senses, it felt like an extended version of an American sitcom. In terms of the plot, it wasn't particularly complicated, but it didn't need to be. It was hugely successful in its own right. It was great fun. And of course, the gimmick of picking which actors from the 6 on stage to play various characters within the piece, meaning that it was going to be different every time, was a really interesting way of keeping actors on their toes, keeping that energy in the room, and that, of course, bounced off on us as an audience. And finally, A Show About Tomorrow, which was a British musical with a promising score and a really intriguing plot, also had, as I say, that formatting gimmick whereby you, the audience, were asked in advance of the show which of the 4 outcomes you would like to have. But they were so broadly sketched, normally with one word, that actually it meant the surprise was retained until you saw the end of the show. And that show was about a group of young people having a party in the 1990s when the end of the world is announced, and how that affects each of the individuals. So, a genuine existential crisis musical. And as I say, all three of these shows were great, and they are the three shows that Colm and I are going to be talking about today. But I want to give you a sense of what those shows were like by reading you the blurbs before we get into the discussion. So in reverse order, let's talk about A Show About Tomorrow. It was described as a one-act musical set in the 90s at Bailey's 21st birthday party, which happens to be in the middle of nowhere. The party is going as well as any party could go, until it is rudely interrupted by the end of the world. The musical follows the different reactions of the guests as they realise their life is ending before it has even really started. They battle with their morals, their desires, and their needs as they struggle to decide what is right and wrong at the end of the world. And that was provided by a company called Disaster Class and had a score by Dominic Semwanga, who also directed the show. And he's part of the National Youth Theatre, so he knows what he's doing. So that's A Show About Tomorrow. Here's the blurb for the show that we're going to talk about in the middle of today's episode, Reject Me Already, which is described as an original rom-com musical where you play the matchmaker. Step into the story of Cameron and Casey, two hopeless romantics looking for their someone, their soulmate. They know they're out there, they just don't know who it is. And in this rom-com, neither do the actors. Not until showtime. Then it's up to the audience to pick who plays which role and who ends up with who. 6 actors, 6 roles, 1 story. Over 20 possibilities. Take a little chance on love in this jazzy, big-hearted, feel-good musical from newcomer Paul Richard Keegan. And that was produced by the Sacred Heart University Theatre Arts Programme. And Paul Richard Keegan produced a beautiful effervescent score for that. But our conversation today is going to start with Fringe, ! The musical. And the description for this show is that Chantal Dupre always dreamed of becoming a star. From her humble upbringing in an American Midwestern town, she decides to travel across the pond to perform a one-woman show at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in search of fame and fortune. Will she get her big break, or will she discover some uncomfortable truths? Fringe the musical tackles the deep relationship between an artist's ego and their art. Crammed full of catchy tunes, witty humour and larger-than-life characters, Live the Dream. And the name of the company that produced that is Little Big Stack. And of course, as I've mentioned, this is, if you like, the successor show to the amazing Potty the Plant, which was Musical Talk's Pick of the Fringe in 2023, and an absolute must-see at the EdFringe in 2024. So that's what we're going to get today. I hope that reading out the blurbs for those shows will give you a sense of what the creatives were trying to do in bringing people in to see these shows. And it worked for me, and it worked for Colm, because see those shows we did, and enjoy those shows we did as well, which is why we're talking about them in this week's episode of Musical Talk. So, in just a minute, you'll hear a conversation between me and Colm about A Show About Tomorrow, Reject Me Already, and Fringe, ! The musical. But before that, let's hear a song from Fringe, ! The musical, which is the hashtag slogan for the show. This is Live the Dream from Fringe! The musical.
I'm gonna live forever. This is my destiny. I'm gonna rule this city. They won't be expecting me. The trials and tribulations, I'm leaving them all behind. 'Cause I'm gonna live forever. I'm gonna live my dream. Da 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 da. Oh, can you feel the air around you?
Colm.
Hello, Thos.
Hello, Colm. As always, a delight talking to you, and I hope a double delight for us both, because we're going to revisit an Edinburgh Festival Fringe where we had an enormous overlap in a number of shows that we saw together.
Yes, I apologise for that. I piggybacked on your tour around the city.
I was delighted that you were there, because it's always good to have a sound and sensible person to see these shows with and discuss them with afterwards. And you have passed that particular qualification with flying colours.
Thank you.
But it is actually genuinely nice to see shows with people who also know what they're talking about. You know, you're a composer, you're a lyricist, you're a great man of theatre in your own right. And therefore, Edinburgh, which is bubbling with ideas and shows, is a wonderful place to just see what the current temperature seems to be at the fringe level of musical theatre. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So today we're just going to have a gallop through our Edinburgh experiences of musical theatre for the most part. And we're going to do what we normally do. We're going to talk about shows that we either loved or thought were very good, or if they weren't quite so good for whatever reason, but they had some interesting point about them, we'll also talk about those as well. So it's the things that interested us or excited us, either in whole or in part, about some of the shows that we saw at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. We can't talk about every single one, and indeed not every single one was good. Let us be honest, but you expect that in Edinburgh, and it's as good to see bad shows as it is to see wonderful shows, because actually a bad show can be informative and educative in its own right. But we're not here to kick people down, we're here to talk about the things we liked. And we're going to start, I think, with a show which is so self-referential, it sort of put itself at the top of the list of the things we wanted to talk about today, which is
Fringe the Musical, which is the same creative team behind Potty the Plant, which
it is indeed.
I know was your pick of the Fringe last year, and I really liked it as well.
You saw it last year and this year, yes.
Sure. Did you see it twice in the end this year?
No, I was only able to see it once in the end.
So Fringe is there. It comes on before Potty the Plant. We saw it after we saw Potty the Plant, and it's a nice companion piece, and it's similarly droll, similarly zany, and is about this one woman whose name you'll remind me. I was going to say Jacqueline Dupre, which is the cellist, but the surname is Dupree. Oh, put me out of my misery.
Unless you've got the tablet, I won't. It'll still be up on the Fringe website. But
you can look up on the Fringe website. Yeah. Follows the life of this glamorous actress whose career began when she was at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe many, many years ago, and it's this romp through Edinburgh with various oddballs such as a flyer, buskers, a stand-up comic, megalomaniac director, that kind of thing.
That's right.
And again, I thought it was delightful. I think there were a couple of things that I really wanted it, that I think it could have done just to have made it even better. The framing device of her being interviewed in the future, or I guess our present day, it would have been nice to revisit that, because the whole show is essentially a flashback.
It is. It starts with us as the audience in a chat show in America, where she's the guest.
It's the Rockefeller Center, I think.
I think something like that, yeah. But, it's an American studio environment, including someone holding up a piece of card that says applause or clap or laugh.
Now boo, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And she is being encouraged to talk about her career and how she's the biggest star in the world now. So how did that all start? And then we get this very strange flashback to it all started at the Fringe, which is an odd place to think about reaching international stellar fame, but that's the conceit of the piece.
There are West End stars at the Fringe this year.
Yes, but did they start at the Fringe?
I take
the comics do, of course.
Sure.
Yeah. But here's the thing I thought was quite interesting about it, and why I think it's tonally slightly different to Potty. I think Potty is an out-and-out romp, and very, very funny. I mean, it is terribly funny, and I like it a lot. I liked Fringe, but they were clearly doing something slightly different, because throughout this world of zanies, there was also a sincere story going on about the man who's introduced as a stand-up comedian, who sort of becomes an on-off friend of our heroine as she's struggling in her ambition to achieve something at the Edinburgh Fringe and not doing terribly well, as it happens. And then, without giving what it is away, there is a wonderful twist at the end where we discover something about him as a character, and then we discover something that's happened to him as a character. And that rug is pulled so perfectly at just the right moment. There's a very significant thing that happens in relation to an instrument case, where we think something's going to happen, and a very different thing happens. And I was genuinely surprised by that, and I was genuinely touched by the implications of it. And I think it sort of stopped the room, because up to that point, as you say, we had all these weird characters, And also a lot of lovely observation about some of the madnesses at the Fringe, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that plot of sincerity and twist, I thought was delightful, and what made it different to Potty the Plant. So I like the flavours, the comedy flavours, and I like the music because I like the composing team, which is Baden Burns. But I really like the fact they wanted to do something slightly different here. There was a little bit of heart, whereas Potty doesn't really have that. Potty lives in a very oddly amoral, cynical, but fun universe. But, very little has consequence.
Sure.
Here, consequences existed.
And I guess that's what you're implying, is that there's a dramatic climax.
Yes, I think I am. A sincere one.
Yeah. And at the top of Arthur's Seat, of all places, so...
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
But let's pick out some of the songs and frippery. Well, there was a lovely 80s song. Do you remember it?
Oh, yeah. On the roller skates.
On the roller skates. We had 4 members of the team. There was also a lot of jokes about Starlight Express. And the problem is you can't separate Starlight Express from the concept of roller skates. So they were having their cake and they were eating it. But there was a lovely sequence. And I thought it sounded very 80s. I mean, I'm not sure it was terribly apropos of the plot, but it was quite sketchy in terms of what was going on.
We forgave it.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that moment, sure.
And there were also songs associated with the bad composer. There was this very pretentious composer-writer character who had had one hit and never been able to be successful since, but was still acting like he was an enormous star. And he was launching his new show at the Fringe in the hope that he was going to have lightning strike twice. And he's terrible as a person. He was also terrible as a writer. And funny enough, Zach Burns, who's the wonderful red-headed Dave the nurse in Potty the Plant, was playing a very interesting, sincere character here, who was basically taken on as a no-money intern, and ends up sort of having a dramaturgical role on this chap who's an absolute rotter, really, empty vessel.
This is the director, yes?
Yeah, the director character, that's right.
I felt that was another moment where I thought, again, if we're in this idea that it's this heroine's flashback, it's hard to make that intellectual leap that she's also aware of this going on. And I wonder if this were to go through another draft or another development stage, if there was a way to make that moment feel more coherent with the through narrative.
What would you do there then? What would you do to dramaturge this? Because I think you and I touched on a couple of things when we discussed it in passing, and you had a really good idea, I thought.
I can't remember what I said, but now just thinking about it, I wonder if that director character could be someone in her present as well. He's there in America somehow. He's become this big shot director, so she can reflect back on him in that sense, even if there is this level of fantasy or extemporising.
Well, I think that's what I remember you saying, and I thought that's such a good idea, and I'd sort of been playing with it in my own head, was the idea that it starts off in this studio, it's a flashback to Edinburgh. You're right, she has flashback elements which you can't possibly know or experience. The way to make that work then at the end is for you to cut back to the studio, which we don't do. We end the story in the Edinburgh story. Cut back to the studio, and it turns out that she could have married the stand-up comic. She could have had the director turns out to be their best friend, or the Zach Burns character, the young dramaturg, could be a mate of theirs. They could have all, they could all come onto stage. So she says, "And here are my family and friends who have helped me get where I am today."
Yeah.
And they turn out to be all the people she met at the Fringe, which means she would have had access to the stories, so she could do it in the. It made logical sense. I think it was a lovely little connection. I do know that, because I had the great pleasure of interviewing the team again about their revival of Potty, but also Fringe, that actually they wish they'd had a bit more time to do with it. They've had a very busy year, and there are things they would still like to do with it. So there are possibilities. It was quite it wasn't as developed as they would have liked. Did you think it was funny?
I think it was, and I thought it was funnier than I thought it was going to be.
Yes, same here, funny enough, yeah.
I feel like this is a bit like deja vu in that I think I'm going to say a similar thing to what we were saying about Potty the Plant last year. I wonder if there's an element in Fringe the Musical as both the title and in its branding or advertising that doesn't quite let on enough to what the show is about. And I know you also have to keep your hand secret, the cards that you're holding.
Yeah.
I understand that dramatically and in terms of getting bums on seats. But what I'm learning about the people who write these shows is they pack a lot more in than they're currently fitting on their posters or their blurbs. And I don't know how you do it, but I think I'd like to see them getting the credit they deserve.
I agree with that. The thing about the word Fringe the Musical is, unfortunately, people have had the idea before. I mean, this Edinburgh alone, there was a second show called Fringe the Musical, which started later in the run. It was one was Fringe Exclamation Mark. I didn't have a chance. But this, ironically, the second one was actually set in a hairdressing salon. So the Fringe there is a literal hair thing. So that's quite a neat pun, but a very different show. A few years ago, I had the great pleasure of seeing, I think it was called Fringe the Musical or Fringe the Review, which was a series of sketches. And that was excellent, and I remember the man behind that had hoped to do that on an annual basis, taking old songs out and putting new songs in so it reflected the ever-changing landscape of the Fringe, because when I started doing the Fringe...
Review-esque.
Well, yes, but also the Fringe has changed. When 15 years ago, there weren't many magicians. You can't move for magicians now. Ironically, the one thing they don't do is disappear. Things like that. There are lots of things, but they still managed to find a few things which we all recognised. Did you see? You saw the silent disco sequence?
Yes. And in fact, I was really taken by the made-up flyers they had.
Oh, brilliant.
Planty the Pot. What was the Lenin one? Was it Lenin? Was it Stalin?
No, there was... because last year there was a drama show called IOP Hitler.
Yeah.
And this was called Hello Stalin or something, wasn't it? Yes, quite...
Yeah, again, just attention to detail, so good.
And that was a throwaway, wasn't it? These were fake flyers just on the back wall or on a kind of desk's prop. And they weren't really referred to. They were an Easter egg for you to enjoy if you were spotting them.
Yeah, really good.
So we really liked it. And I think with just a little bit of fine-tuning, that show could easily be revived again or developed further. I'd like to see it again. But I agree with your point. I think you make a very shrewd point, but some of the titles of the shows aren't quite selling what you're getting because they're almost too light, or they're just not packed with enough. There's depth to these.
Yeah, and I know that there are shows that were on this year and shows that we even saw, or shows that we didn't see, that have titles that are going to draw in an audience, shows that will have sold out before they've even opened.
A subtitle can do a lot as well, can't it?
A subtitle can do a lot, a title can do a lot. So, yes.
But you could call it Fringe the Musical and then a subtitle like something like, the inside story to the top from the bottom or something like that, because then that suggests there's a rise and fall thing going on. Or
yes, I don't know.
Yeah, it's not our decision, but there feels like there's some untapped potential in the titling which could bring more people into these terribly good shows. Just briefly, you saw Potty again this year. Did you enjoy it again?
I loved it, yes. It was really good to see it, and I'm thrilled they've got the cast recording out.
Yes, they have, at last. Very pleased.
Yeah. Sorry to come back to Fringe, because I think it's about so much more than just the Fringe.
Yes.
That's the backdrop of the whole thing. Anyway, they'll figure it out, but it's a good story.
It is. Great. That's Fringe, and that's our headlining show because it's about the Fringe. So Fringe the Musical was a show that took the Fringe ostensibly as its context and actually told a story in front of it. And that was its gimmick, if you want to call it that, or its unique selling point. We saw a lot of shows that had different gimmicks or selling points, but we saw one called Reject Me Already. And would you like to explain what its unusual thing was that it was luring people in with?
The selling point is that it's a rom-com musical, and you get to pick the cast. It's a cast of 6, but it's audience votes. You decide which roles they're going to play.
Are they going to be the main couple, the secondary couple, or all the supporting characters?
Yes.
How it's sort of divided
and
up,
all the characters have gender-neutral names, so it allows for all permutations to exist, which is fun. And I found it quite charming in a way. I really enjoyed the unnecessarily good projections, the lights and the colours.
And by projections you mean a stage projection. These are set scenery rather than projection from the diaphragm.
Yes. Well, that's a given in a musical, isn't it?
Well,
you'd hope so.
Lovely diction. I could see it from the third row.
Could you? God. Where were you? Anyway, but what you said that it was a lot like watching Friends. For me, it reminded me a lot of Promises. It has that kind of...
Oh, the Bacharach and David musical.
Yeah, kind of had that sitcom, rom-com...
almost innocent romance.
Yeah. I haven't watched much Friends, but...
No, all right, but I know it has a feel.
Yes. This felt... one of the characters was not even a songwriter, but a kind of, I'm losing my words now, an engraver copying out sheet music for a musician in an orchestra. I don't think you're seeing much of that in Friends.
No,
I do
you're
think
right.
you're seeing that in a Neil Simon play, maybe. So that was my connection to Promises.
I'll buy
Promises.
that. It had the feel of Friends or an American sitcom, and the projections you're talking about were there was a kind of musical. It was transition from scene to scene, and it was quite often a photograph of a rather swanky-looking an apartment block in an American town,
Yes.
with a bit of incidental music to link from one to the other. That's what I meant by the Friends feeling, the sitcom. I really like your Neil Simon, Bacharach and David concept, and I think that's a better thing. Let's briefly explain the plot beats. It's not complicated. It was an hour or 50 minutes. One of the reasons it also felt like an extended sitcom is because after 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes when you've sorted out who's going to play what parts, you're down to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Half, that's 2 episodes of an American sitcom together, perhaps. The plot is boy meets girl in slightly unusual, wacky circumstances.
A meets B.
That's right. Oh, well, in our case, it was boy meets girl. You're right. A meets B. Very good point. And I've seen from photographs online that all combinations have occurred.
Oh, great.
So it's not just heteronormative. So A meets B in a restaurant after they're both sort of stood up in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
One is properly stood up, I seem to remember, and the other one is meets her blind date who turns out to be a rotter and gets arrested. And there's a very sassy waiting member of staff. So the 2 people who ultimately were playing all the parts played the bad date and the person who was a waitress on the day we went.
Yeah.
And then there's the secondary couple who are a loving couple who are therefore sort of there to make sure they match make. So that's their sort of function, and be a successful couple in the background while making sassy comments. And then our slightly bumbly couple, actually, I really like them because they weren't confident. They were actually a little bit nervous and clumsy in their approaches to each other. So they sort of get together. There's a brief moment of jeopardy where someone misunderstands something, a conversation is overheard.
Yeah.
So
never eavesdrop is the lesson.
It really is. And then so a boy loses girl, if you're using that paradigm, but A loses B, and then it's all made right again when they realise the problem. So A and B get back together again, and that is the plot.
Yeah.
So nothing much going on there. But the whole thing was wrapped up in a world of charm, I thought.
Yeah, I don't want to put it down too much, but it really felt like the conceit helped a lot with the show, and with the joy, the novelty of that made it an enjoyable experience.
It gave it an extra oomph
Yeah.
that perhaps it might not have had if it was just a plain sitcom comedy musical. Well, it was a tour de force for the people who got to play the bit parts, because they got to really, those characters were more grotesque.
That's true.
Yeah, this is Tracy Bennett in Here You Are, getting all the plum parts.
That's true. Yeah, it is that. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I enjoyed it for that reason, and sometimes it's just nice to see a complication get resolved.
There was one song I particularly liked, fun enough, and it was where our, in this case, on the night we went, our male hero, romantic entanglement partner, was singing a song about the woman he just met. It was just a very simple song, and it was her name for the most part. But actually, I found it very touching because it encapsulated all that character that we were talking about. The clumsiness, it was a tuneful piece, it was nicely sung. It had all that kind of, there's nerves in this, as you might have on a successful date, oh my goodness, this has gone well, I'd like to see them again, but is that going to happen? So, that one song for me stood out over the rest of the score. The rest of the score was very sweet and very pleasant, but I remember that song even now. It's hard to describe it because, as we're sort of saying, the piece isn't really striving to push at the envelope in any way or do anything very edgy. But it's not in any way at fault for that. It's lovely.
No. It's become a habit of mine recently to kind of think, what would I do if I were doing that? If I were writing that show? And again, this isn't me trying to put the show down, but I almost fantasize thinking, could you set up this premise and then about 2/3 of the way through, the actors playing the characters in a contrived sort of way decide that actually they're fed up, they have to play this, they always get picked as the waiter, or they always get picked to play the bad guy kind of thing, and they act up and show, so the show falls apart in a sense.
Sort of deconstructs itself.
It deconstructs itself because it's already constructed in that kind of way anyway. It's got that framing device, so why not use that to its strengths and make the show fall apart that way? So then that's the complication.
Well, I don't disagree with you with that, because fun enough, I actually felt the unique selling point of the you pick your cast members was slightly missold, not deliberately.
No.
But I actually thought that what you did was they all play characters, and then you pick the characters you wanted rather than the actors you wanted. Are you picking actor A and actor B to be the two characters? And then those characters forged their relationship. And it does say in the programme and online, you say, come back and see us every time to see how it works out differently on every occasion. But actually, unless I'm wrong, the way I got it was that you'd see you see the same story, but you'd see different nuances as different actors were playing the same characters and going through the same dramatic movement of the story. What I would quite like to see, and I think it ties in with your deconstructionist, actually, how do we save this now from the deconstruction that's occurred, is actually that, I mean, you would, I think, if you were writing, you'd sketch out possibilities for each of the ones, so the actors in their head know where they're going in terms of a rough story, but actually it would be relatively improvised. What I didn't get from this was any sense of improvisation. What I got was each of the actors has presumably had to learn all the roles.
6 roles.
Yeah,
it's hard.
I mean, it's a big job.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and if you don't mind, it reminded me of another show that we saw that also had an element of an audience deciding, which was a show about tomorrow, which had 4 different endings.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. Yes, that was on the same day, I think, the day we saw it, in the morning. Yes,
one of the early
that was a
shows
British musical. The Reject Me Already was much more North American. It was either Canadian or American.
But similarly, this had... Well, not similarly. You came in not knowing what the show was going to be about, and you were given a multiple choice, pick 4 endings that you'd like to see, and then the one that gets the most votes is the one that does happen.
They weren't terribly descriptive of things like fire, Tesco's, which is a supermarket, or
chocolate.
Yeah, exactly. It was.
But again, a similar. The comparison I'm drawing is, regardless of which outcome is picked, up until that point, the show is still identical. That's
true, yeah. And then it just has a little bit of an extra flavour.
I'm not sure how I feel about, but it's it's a thing.
Yeah, in a show about tomorrow, what we actually got, if you remember rightly, was the epilogue of the story was projected on the screen. It was words, like you see at the end of a biopic. It's someone, it says Fred goes on to live another 50 years and he marries his dog or whatever it is. In this case, they gave you what happened to the characters after this situation had worked its way through in the plot, and it related to whatever one of the 4 options, but it was slightly tacked on. It wasn't, as you say, plot relevant at all. Okay, as we're going on to that one, then I think we should touch on that one briefly.
Sure.
Very British in its sense, in its sensibilities. The show is essentially about people having a party. Someone's having a birthday party, I seem to remember, and it turns out she's got massive anxiety problems, and therefore she's been lying to people about the wonderful things she's been doing when in fact she hasn't been able to move at all. Anyway, the friends will come to the party, and then the party goes about the way parties do, and there's sort of mix-ups and misunderstandings and who's got the beer and all this kind of stuff, and then there's a sudden announcement that the world's going to end. And then the rest of it is, what would you do? And this was the selling point of the piece, really, not the gimmicky ending, is what would you do if someone said to you, the world is ending in 6 hours?
Yeah.
And various of them go off and react in the ways you might expect in that situation.
Do things they wouldn't ordinarily do.
Indeed,
exactly.
Or reevaluate their lives. The thing I thought was interesting, but maybe could have been worked through, is the fact that what we really saw was each of them having their own episode on their own. There might be another person they were talking to, but we saw character X have a meltdown, we saw character Y have guilt, we saw character C, I'm going in the wrong order for the alphabet, but you get the idea, wanting to try to escape. There was character 4 who was trying to bargain with the gods. It was all that kind of stuff.
I'm sure Louis Spoonell would have enjoyed it from his point of view, because there's an element of being trapped or the world ending, or
in his films.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. Which, of course, for people who may not understand the reference, were the 2 films. He did 2 films, which ultimately became Sometimes Here We Are. Yeah.
So I enjoyed it. It reminded me of that, as in it had that element to it, but in a more kind of urban setting, and these were younger people, so they have different impulses.
Yeah, I think that's... Yeah. There was also one who was keen on drugs, and there was one who was keen on sex, as you might imagine. Yes. Listen up, children. What I heard someone wisely once say, said... Don't get hammered, get screwed.
Oh, okay.
So that's... but I enjoyed that piece, but I don't remember any of the music from it, interestingly. I remember the dramatic narratives and beats much more strongly.
I remember it having leaning more into a hip-hop R&B kind of score,
It did, and there was some reggae as well, wasn't there?
There was a song where one of the characters locked himself in the bathroom and sang a song to himself, which is very much kind of a spoken word, fast-paced rap. Yeah. That's all I distinctly remember.
Good remembering. I'd forgotten that because tonally it was all a little bit of a type.
Yeah.
I think we also concluded that some of the songs felt like they'd been written before the show had. I remember that being a discussion on the day, but hard to remember now because we saw so many shows. But I enjoyed it very much. I would criticise it for one thing, which is that it pulled its punch on the end of the world story.
Yeah.
And that's hard not to do, because otherwise you have a very bleak storytelling problem. However, a worthy show.
Yeah.
Oh, very much so.
So here we are. This is better than gold. You could kill me with a smile, and I know you're on my side when the road is rough ahead. And there it is. You will never grow old. I know I'm not the same, but I know you're not to blame. You'll be waiting for me till the end of time. So turn back the clocks and I'll say that I'm sorry to when I was 17. You were enough, I was blind, and I'm sorry to when I was 17. To when I was 17. And so it goes. The sun rises each day. You were open to forgive. You desired for me to live. I'll be living up to you for all my life. So turn back the clocks and I'll say that I'm sorry to when I was 17. You were enough, I was blind, and I'm sorry to when I was 17. To when I was 17. All of my life, they say I've been lucky. All of those fights, I know I've been lucky. Lucky knowing you. So turn back the clocks and I'll say that I'm sorry to when I was 17. You were enough, I was blind, and I'm sorry to when I was 17. To when I was 17. To when I was 17. To when I was 17.
And there we are, 17. Another song from Fringe, the musical. And I'm hugely indebted to Baden Burns for allowing me to play 2 songs from that wonderful show. And what a wonderful contrast they were. Really showing, I think, how different Fringe the Musical was in its tone to Potty the Plant. And before that, of course, you heard me and Colm Malloy discussing 3 of the shows that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. In reverse order, that was A Show About Tomorrow, Reject Me Already, and Fringe, ! The Musical. And in each case, each show had something which made it worthwhile. Something that really spoke to Colm or me and made us want to talk about it. Sometimes it's a particular piece of music or the whole score or a really thought out idea for a plot or sometimes just an idea behind a plot. But all 3 of those shows had something, and I'd like to see any of those shows again, and I'd like to see further work by the people behind those shows. And if you get a chance to see them at any time in the future, do give them a whirl. Well, I think that more or less brings this episode of Musical Talk to an end. We'll be back again next week with yet more discussions on some of the shows that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. But also, not just a simple review, Colm and I will be talking about the role of morality in some of the scripting of some of the shows that were on offer this year. Because there was an interesting flavour amongst the shows in a trending sense, and not just in musicals, that left a little bit of a nasty taste in the mouth. Probably a sign of the dissonant times in which we live, and probably very reflective of that sense of people not being very happy either with themselves or their fellow humans. So do join Colm and I next week when we look a little bit more into what was being presented and perhaps something to avoid, I hope, for other creatives who are writing musicals in the future. So do join us for that. So until the next time here on Musical Talk, it's time for me to say goodbye. And this week I'm going to do so from the song Goodbye from the musical Catch Me If You Can. So, no violins or phony tears, the word that's music to my ears is goodbye. Well, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Colm Malloy and Thos Ribbits, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2024, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the original creators. And my enormous thanks go to them for allowing me to play their wonderful songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos. Lovely. Do you want to give me a level?
You're listening to the BBC. The time for my Everright analogue watch is something o'clock. And I'm here with Thos Ribbits. And Thos not only ribbits, he bow wows and he barks. He was as tired as a dog.
He was. Mate, this name won't mean anything to you, will it? Alvar Liddell.
No.
In the Second World War, the BBC newsreaders who'd previously been told not to give their names because the news was just not to be interpreted, it was just the BBC giving the news. In the Second World War, in order to stop Nazi fake propaganda, people thinking that the BBC, someone said I'm the BBC News and it wasn't, they gave names. How this was supposed to stop anyone, but people were supposed to recognise the names, yes. And one of the great names of the Second World War is... This is the BBC News from London, and this is Alvar Liddell reading it. One of the greatest names, I think, ever in broadcasting.
Alvar Liddell. Great.
Lovely.